what kind of man are you? What kind of husband are you?
Right.
Like, and they only focus on the one little part that talks about teaching, and they take their liberty with that and overlook all the character flaws,
Yeah.
which are the big thing.
Yeah. Well, the consequence of that has been rather disastrous, I would say, because, the non-denominational movement, which we know was financially supported by the SBC, created all of these parachurch organizations. And, if you go out and get a Christian book, there's a very good chance that it's written by a parachurch organization and not somebody, not a publisher that has those manuscripts run by theologians, educated theologians who are scanning it for bad doctrine and fleshing that out. You don't get that. And so what happened was you had a whole bunch of parachurch organizations, these publishers, putting out teachings about men and women that were based on these false views that you would find in the SBC. And you had regular, everyday, self-professing evangelicals who thought that they were following Scripture by following what these books said. And I think it should come as no surprise that we have this deconstructionist movement right now. I think that the unfortunate part is that deconstruction is, it's supposed to be about deconstructing this bad theology, but what ends up getting, swooped up into that is Christianity itself. But this should not be a surprise, because this doctrine that came out of the SBC, especially about men and women, is false. It should be deconstructed. And none of that is to say that the egalitarians have the right arguments on that either.
No, yeah, of course. And I think a lot of the toxic teaching that has come out of a lot of these evangelical groups like the SBC and such have fueled and given fire to egalitarianism and feminism, because if what these people over here were teaching is wrong, then what's right is probably over here. Mm-hmm. And they're saying a lot of things that make men and women feel better about where they think they need to be.
Yeah.
And so if those bad teachings are wrong, then these over here must be right. So I'm just going to give it a try and see how it goes.
Yeah, well, it's. I actually have an article about this pattern of deconstruction that I've observed among evangelical women. So these are women who grew up in evangelical circles, usually purity culture, complementarian types. And the thing that I've observed is that when those women who are hearing the gospel, or the closest thing to the gospel that they've heard, and then they also hear these teachings on women, which, if you look at them, they're actually contradictory. I've said for a long time that I think complementarianism is a second gospel. It's a works-based gospel for women. But when you compare those two, then questions start coming up, like how does this view of women square with this view of the gospel? And so those women naturally start asking questions, and they go to their pastor or whomever, and the pastor gives sort of these superficial questions intended to shoo her away and let her know everything's okay. Both are true, even if you can't reconcile them in your mind. And after this back and forth of asking questions and not getting real answers that actually reconcile the two, right? Then you start looking outside. And when you look outside, you find these egalitarian, I think social media really facilitated this. You step into an egalitarian Facebook group, and suddenly you find there's all these other women and men who have the same exact questions. We're saying, okay, if this is true about the gospel, how can this be true about complementarianism? And so now you have a community of individuals who can relate to one another, right? And they start raising more questions, and you take those questions back to your pastor. Well, now the questions that you're bringing back to your pastor, well, they sound a lot like feminism, or they sound a lot like egalitarianism. And so now there's this antagonism that exists between the pastor and these women who are asking questions. And so now the woman senses this, and she starts to realize, oh, I'm the enemy. So of course she's going to leave. And where does she go to? She goes to the group of people that she can relate to, who don't treat her like an enemy. They have wrong answers. In fact, people have asked me why I'm not egalitarian or feminist, and I tell them, well, it's not because of their theology, although that's a separate issue. But the reason why I'm not egalitarian is because of my philosophical education. I look at their arguments, I just say these are bad arguments. And so it's my philosophical training that keeps me from being egalitarian or feminist. But theologically, I hold to qualified male-only ordination. But I also see some terrible arguments that are used to support that.
Right.
But at any rate, so of course you have women leaving the church in droves. They were asking questions and didn't get answers, and even were treated as though they were enemies. And to varying degrees, I think the example of Amy Bird was probably the most extreme. I shouldn't say the most extreme, but the most visible example of being treated like an enemy once you start asking too many questions, right? So, of course, you have this this divide. And if you have women who haven't really been trained in the gospel, or they read through those passages about women, and let me tell you something, because I spent time in that non-denominational church, where they promoted John MacArthur and John Piper and Doug Wilson, reading through all of those pink passages, the passages that are used to refer to women and their role in the church or the family or whatnot. Those are incredibly distorted now, and it takes some conscious effort to untwist what's been taught to you, untwist those distortions from what Scripture is actually saying. But that's difficult when you also have some of these other pastors who are very well intentioned. They don't have these misogynistic sort of views, but they also don't want to touch this topic with a 10-foot pole. And they'll say things like, in their sermons, they'll get to the passage about women submitting to their husbands. And they'll preface that by saying, this is a notoriously difficult passage in Scripture. But I hear that for every single passage that talks about women. So on the one hand, we have the perspicuity of Scripture, right? The gospel is supposed to be clear to us. And on the other hand, every single passage about women is very difficult and, notoriously difficult to interpret. So is God confused about women, or are you confused about women? Because it doesn't make sense. If Scripture is clear and the gospel is clear, then it doesn't make sense that that becomes confusing when women enter into the picture. And yet that's what so many women have been taught through evangelical circles, through these parachurch organizations, and they're not getting their questions answered except by the egalitarians. So the pattern is striking, but it's there.
That's actually a really good point.